All right, good morning. I'll close this session. We got the Internet Defense Prize last year at USENIX Security for a comprehensive evaluation of third-party cookie policies. The focus of this talk is on the web browser and its extensions, and to which extent the web browser is typically implementing the policies, let's say, as promised. We all know that there are in the web environment a lot of security challenges, and a major one is caused by the sharing of cookies. Historically, the web protocol, HTTP, that was the driver of the big success of the World Wide Web, is stateless. And of course, application builders had from the very beginning to invent and create a technique to share state. And the somewhat funny name cookie emerged from that. A cookie is basically state shared between a client on the one hand and the website that you're serviced by on the other hand. However, a web page in its own right is a composite of many ingredients, very often generated by third parties. So the simple example that you see on the slide is that a domain A includes an image from a domain B, and cookies that are basically representing the state of the browser session between domain A and the client are automatically or by default shared with domain B. And that allows domain B to abuse eventually authentication tokens as one principal example, or just leverage on information that leaks from the client to that domain B, and that leads to undesirable ads, tracking, privacy breaches, and so on. It's a well-known problem, I'm sure. So that's where we come from. And this leads to two major problems, as I already indicate here. There are, let's say, severe security problems on the one hand, and maybe also severe privacy problems on the other hand. And the most common example of that is the cross-site request forgery, where an attacker can perform authenticated actions with the account of the victim. Let's assume a very friendly website being visited. This leaves authentication tokens and relevant information in the state. Somebody hacks that site and puts malicious code that is downloaded with, for example, an image or a serviced page, and that image would allow the attacker to force the victim to use that information to do an undesirable transaction on a bank. This is the pedagogical start to say that what is this all about? Now, some of you may say cross-site request forgery is not so much a big issue. We know it has been for a long time, and many big events have occurred. It has been in the OWASP top 10 for a long time. It is getting out of that picture for many reasons. I'm sure bug bounty hunters have revealed enough problems to the website developers that sort of the awareness and the how-to on how to secure the code at the server side is an improving skill, and that's a great thing. But on the other hand, it would be much more powerful to make sure that from a client perspective, the leaking of these cookies is blocked, and that the quality of the server that you visit is definitely not the cause or the only reason why you would be secured. So from that respect, cross-site request forgery still is a problem, because you have to ubiquitously apply best practices on the server side, while you could maybe have just a default security implementation on the client side, on the browser side. In order to deal with the latter, same-site cookie has been introduced, which delivers you security by default. What is a same-site cookie? It's a cookie with an additional attribute called same-site, no surprise, and it would label that cookie as one that cannot be shared at all with any other web page apart from the one it was serviced from, and that would be the strict option. Or it could be relaxed a little bit, where you have top-level domains sharing it via GET, no post obviously, or pre-rendering facility. So that is a sort of an intermediate version that really restricts the sharing of the cookies. And these type of evolutions are what we call third-party cookie policies that are proposed as a standard and subsequently adopted by browser vendors to make sure that client-side security quality gets better and better. So The same site lacks option, for example, would be, as of version 76, the default in Google Chrome. It takes a while to adapt. That's what we say here. In practice, if you look at the example again, a victim could go to the bank, get cookies, but the same site cookie policy attribute would then not allow cute kittens in this example to take advantage of that information, and subsequently it would not be possible to have that malicious behavior. I mention here cross-site request forgery as a sort of a pedagogical example. We have cross-site code injection, we have timing attacks in the browser. There's a broader range of attacks that should not be explained in depth here that all leverage on that potential problem. This is a big problem. Many cases have been reported in the public with big financial losses and impact. That's the security bit. The privacy bit, it's clear that independent of heavyweight attacks with significant financial losses, in these days, I don't have to tell you that trackers is a huge activity. There are recent studies, for example, here, showing that almost all pages visited contain third-party requests to trackers. This is a kind of a default we are dealing with. So there are good reasons to improve the posture on the client side to deal with that. Client-side cookie policies, in the broad sense, have to defend against these problems, and they're very often a built-in browser option, just to block third-party cookies, for example. Most browsers have that option. Support for the new proposal of same-site cookies, as I introduced to you. Specific browsers have additional elements, and Firefox, for example, with its tracking protection, Opera with the ad blocker, Safari with the intelligent tracking prevention, and so on. So there is a knowledge on the side of the browser producers, obviously, to deal with that, and this shows it. In addition, there is an API that allows other parties to build extensions, and we have ad blockers and privacy protection extensions, a numerous amount of them, that can be installed in the context of your browser to hopefully, potentially enhance your security posture. The question now is, and we come back to the opening of the talk, is the browser correctly enforcing the claims that these browser-based standards are stating, and or the promises of the extension builders, are they fulfilled in practice? That was the question we started from, and we had 2 years ago a master student evaluating a couple of setups, and that was like not really encouraging. We saw quite some problems, and the next step beyond that was, let's try to systematically evaluate that for all browsers, for a broad range of extensions, and see to which extent we are dealing with a severe problem or not. Is it easy for a browser builder to deal with that? Well, one illustration, if you think of Firefox, you might say, what is a web security talk doing in a systems conference? Well, in terms of complexity, 36 million lines of code in 2018 in Firefox, and this is probably the most public case and therefore easy to retrieve, is huge. The complexity of systems is comparable. Well, we can have a philosophical debate about it, but we talk about a huge complexity. And the question is, can we, in such a complex piece of software, can anyone easily intercept all the requests and strip third-party cookies from a request? Where are the requests generated in that huge code base? This is not unique to Firefox. If you think about the number of options supported, then you see that they're all competing. And if you look at the announcements, the Edge with the lowest number of features will definitely grow if you look at the release notes of their future versions. So we have to evaluate that. Browsers do not necessarily implement the standards accurately. There are, with all these features, interactions between features that cause side effects that actually still enable the leaking. That's a potential risk. And we know that extensions have been bypassed in the past. For example, through WebSockets, it was a very well-known and published case. So that's the motivation and a little bit of the pedagogical intro in case you might benefit from that, why we did this and why this is a non-trivial case. We had the indications, but there is some rationale as I try to sketch to you. So let me give you an outlook on the result. The standard browsers didn't make it, and none of the extensions was not bypassable. So there was actually no good example. This is interesting because we don't have to say there's a good and a bad one. We were able to bypass all these vehicles in an experiment that we finished in June last year. There has been, after the publication of the paper in August 2018, we have done an extra run because you wonder what happens then. You responsible disclosure, you share that information with all the vendors and they pick it up or they don't pick it up. But it's not so easy for them in a release plan with the number of features I was referring to say, oh, let's re-engineer this or that, because these are not always minor issues. They may have design flaws at the base which you cannot quickly incorporate in your ongoing release plan. So there is a delay in picking it up, and we noticed that because we did an additional evaluation in the fall of 2019, and that has been published in the IEEE Security and Privacy magazine as a sort of an extended version of the USENIX security paper, and the situation has evolved, but very gradually. And I'm not blaming anyone in particular for that, as I made clear. So what is the core work that we have did? We had a testing framework to be developed to do that kind of massive evaluation at large scale, and with the idea to repetitively do that, to have also longitudinal information. That's the idea. And as it's kind of crazy to go at source code level with these types of code bases, we treated the browser as a black box, and the idea was to actually generate all the possible cases that could lead to a bypass of cookie leaking and apply them systematically on all the instances that we wanted to look at. So all the browsers, their versions, and the size of that framework actually depends, of course, on the number of test cases that you generate. And in practice, here is a rough classification that is articulated in detail in the full paper, obviously, where there are a number of obvious, so to speak, for people familiar with this, with web development, obvious possibilities to bypass an interceptor that says, I want to get all the requests that go out, I want to verify whether it's safe from an information leakage perspective, and otherwise I want to block the request and or strip the cookies that I don't want to leak. The latter is the key issue, of course. But if you look at the way we build web applications, there are, for example, obviously HTML tags with images in which you can embed functionality, and that functionality could launch a request. So there's a bunch of HTML tags. That's a huge category with almost 200 scenarios sitting behind it. Response headers can also, apart from the direct resource that is being requested, include additional triggers to add functionality and therefore trigger a request that could be harmful. We include redirects as well, which is a bit debatable if people look at the strict description of certain policies, but a redirect offers that possibility as well. And then there is the big player JavaScript that obviously by adding functionality anywhere can launch requests and also can do that from many PDF viewers, which is interesting. PDF viewers can these days, PDF files can add also functionality, typically embedded JavaScript as well. Most of the browser vendors make their own version of that viewer, and that is in itself another source of vulnerabilities. And then there are a couple of APIs, including the application cache, being deprecated on the one hand, but being heavily used still on the other hand. And actually that application cache is currently replaced by the service worker API, which more or less creates the same cross-origin possibility because it's shared by all the web servers. So that is sort of a rough classification of hundreds of scenarios that can be imposed on the web browser and or extensions to see see whether a leakage occurs. And then this gives you a quick overview of the framework, where you see in the upper left corner a browser control engine that actually starts from a number of configurations that you build based upon all these scenarios that I was trying to classify briefly on the previous slide. The framework manager generates all these test cases, and that produces web pages that try to have the browser downloading a page that bypasses the third-party cookie policy. So on the one hand, the browser talks to the browser control creates browser instances that are tested, and these browser instances are confronted with a number of web pages that correspond to all the potential bypass scenarios that I have sort of classified briefly on the previous slide. Of course, between that browser instance in the right column of the slide, there's a proxy that monitors what's going on and that reports on the leaks and put that in a register. That engine has been obviously applied extensively. Here are the 7 browsers on the left-hand side. There were 47 extensions, a combination of ad blockers and tracking protection players. And here are, in a nutshell, the results of applying that or deploying that framework in the context of all these tools and facilities. So if you look at the full paper, and I will not sort of go into the boring rally of, at this point, rushing through a number of results, but you will see, both for the browser and the extensions, you will see that in light of the 7 categories of ways to bypass actually the protection that is imposed or prescribed by a policy, you see whenever there's a black circle, then it means actually that a request with cookies, that third-party cookies in this context, was able to be sent despite a configuration that was suggesting the opposite. And for example, you see that because redirects are not actually taken care of formally in the policy, this gives you a huge opportunity. You also see, surprisingly, that, for example, the PDF viewers from Opera and Chrome fail to do the job and allow JavaScript to leak third-party cookies, and so on and so forth. So the sort of the main body of the paper, or let's say after the description of the framework, a large inventory of results is described by zooming into particular cases where you say, well, this is surprising, and also reporting on our interaction with the vendors on how to deal with that. So I'll give you this just as a methodological example, but it's clear that there is a huge amount of information sitting behind that, which we actually report on a website that is updated. So whenever a new release of the major browser vendors is coming up, we update that information. And as I said, you can see from that experiment that it's not so trivial for these vendors to run fast. Certain bug fixes can be done. Major flaws cannot easily be fixed necessarily, at least not in the short term. Okay, so as far as the built-in browser policies is concerned, a major element that I mentioned was the bypassing via the PDF viewer in Chrome and Opera. Some of the blocking options, for example, in Edge and Safari, were completely not functioning. They were not doing the job at all. And it's clear that many categories, also in Firefox and Opera, of tracking protection that was built in not by an extension provider, but by the browser producers themselves, were not functioning. So it was a little bit shocking, but on the other hand, I introduced you to the way it grew and the current complexity of a browser. It's easy to write a module that says, if I intercept a request, I can analyze it, strip the cookies I don't want to leak, and then forward it. That piece of logic is easy to imagine for all of us. The problem is, from which locations in the source code do I need to call it to be complete in my coverage? And apparently that's a non-trivial situation today with these huge code bases. So you can wonder about the modularity there. As far as the browser extension is concerned, some of them are really offered to bring you that tracking protection and ad blocking protection. They could all be bypassed. So we had a couple of, we had a workshop later on also with, let's say, a special interest group, closed group, to sort of collaborate on how to improve and share ideas on how to avoid design flows and common implementation mistakes. But it was a little bit overwhelming, as you can imagine. If we now look at the same-site cookie case, which I introduced in the beginning, which is supposed to be a solution and a new standard, we could see that in a number of browsers, this was not working either. Chrome and Opera, for example, were sending a strict cookie in a pre-render request, which is inherently a lax version as a detail. But also, there were bypasses despite the specification of same-site cookie attributes in Edge. So it's a rough landscape of required improvements. So all the details are obviously in the paper and not in the scope of this presentation, but for those who are very much interested, I recommend, of course, reading it, as well as the extended version in IEEE Security and Privacy. So our browser evaluation framework validates the correctness of implicit and explicit policies that are to be enforced. Implicit because a browser claims to be complying with a certain standard. The framework supports all browsers in various configurations. And we believe that such a framework is not just here to say, well, we are here as security researchers. This is an alarm signal, and please listen. We found a lot of problems. It's more like a target for us to make sure that we can validate implementations before release. That's the goal. It's a constructive tool, which is a little bit unlike to many security research results that you may see. In further evaluating our findings, we saw a lot of opportunities to bypass. We crawled the Alexa top 10,000 websites with a max of up to 20 pages per site to see whether the potential bypassing that we discovered through our systematic analysis was actually found in the wild. It was not. It was not, and so to a large extent, there were potential abuses not being exploited as far as we could see. There's a validity issue here. Okay. So in conclusion, bypasses for ad blockers and privacy extensions, as well as for built-in browser policies, understand this situation. The complexity has been grown to a huge level, and our framework in this context is supposed to be evolving to deal with other policies as well, mobile browsers and so on. We got that award from Facebook, and we will sort of invest in extending the work and utilize that money for good purposes. I wanted to finish with this example to sort of, again, say we are not saying, hooray, we found a lot of troubles. It seems to be very difficult to stay consistent. There was the pre-render bug in the same-site cookie policy bypass I mentioned earlier on the slides. It's just one of the problems out of the many. It was reported for version 57 of Chrome. It took them 5 releases to get it out, and it reappeared as of version 66. Tells you a lot about the difficulty of dealing with these type of policies, despite their huge relevance and importance. Thank you. I'm happy to take questions if there's time left.
Yeah, we are a little over, but maybe time for one question.
Hi, Wouter from Indiana University. So from what I understood, like there are 2 motivations for your work. One is the third-party tracking, and the other one is like attack like CSRF, right? So as you know, probably recently there are like a lot of tracking happening with the client-side browser fingerprinting, and they don't even use probably the cookies anymore. And you can't know even if they're tracking you or not, and they're selling your data to other, like, it's like they're actually being transferred between the websites. And I think there are no like actual solution for that. Like the best solution is like Tor that totally disables the JavaScript, because otherwise they can use like unique information from your browser, from your client browser to track you down. So how do you think that affects your motivation in this work?
You're absolutely right that the problem of tracking is not only a matter of leaking third-party cookie policies, third-party cookies. Obviously correct, more advanced techniques like fingerprinting, which we studied in other papers, are part of the spectrum. So I believe that if the consortia, including DubDubDub and other working groups, jointly aim for a certain policy to deal with part of the problem that is not fighting fingerprinting, obviously, and machine learning-based advanced techniques, then it's important to deliver software that to the maximum possible extent complies with the policy it claims to implement. Okay? Do we need other policies, other possibilities to maximize fingerprinting protection? I think so. I could refer to other work that I did with Nefarious, for example, in that space. And that is another line of research, but I don't think it devaluates the relevance of doing this right. I don't think so. But we can argue during the break, but that's my opinion.
Of course, yeah, thanks.
All right, thank you, Wouter. And that's the end of the session.